All right, welcome everyone to another popular culture scholar dialogue. I think I messed that up. So the popular culture dialogue, it's whatever we want to make of it, and it's great. It's fun. I've already gotten a lot of ideas from these conversations, and so I hope the participants and those of you who join us asynchronously are able to as well. Today we're talking about material popular culture. We just got done talking about digital popular culture. So now we're kind of going back old school, maybe, or old school, new school. We'll kind of dive into that today. But I've got a number of different people here who study various aspects of material popular culture. So I'm just going to let them introduce themselves and say a little bit about what brings them here. And to make certain I don't forget him, I'm going to start with Chris right here.
Oh, okay. Well, hello, my name is Christopher J Olson. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where I study media, cinema, and digital studies. Film is my primary research interest, especially cult film. I've done a lot of work on cult film and cult media, but I'm also a board game enthusiast, and that's kind of what brings me here because, in terms of hobbies, board games are highly material in a lot of ways, and yeah, I think that's about it. Anything else?
Well, we've also been doing a lot of puzzles during the pandemic.
We've become puzzle enthusiasts as well.
We have no more room for puzzles, but yes. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of those types of more analog versions of popular culture. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to go over to Victoria.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Victoria Rahbar. I'm a second-year graduate student at Stanford University's Center for East Asian Studies. I am currently working on my master's thesis, which is going to try to address how the materiality of manga, which are comics with origins in Japan, can provide us with insights on both the history of publishing manga as well as the reading experience. The work that I'm working with mainly, I use work too much, is Cardcapture Sakura. And that's because it's continually getting republished in both digital and print forms, and also putting out a lot of character goods in both countries, in Japan and the United States, increasingly globally, over the last 25 years for America and 30 years for Japan. So I also wanted to mention something at the very last of my intro. I brought stuff with me today because one of the positives of us working from home is that we can actually share with each other our collections. What does materiality of comics look like? Let me show you. So I hope that we can do a little bit of show and tell today.
Well, I would say also I brought my pets down from their place in the bedroom. So yeah, definitely we can do a show and tell. This is my favorite, but yeah. Okay, thank you, Victoria. Let's go down to Heidi.
Hello, I'm Heidi. I am located in Denver. I am in a joint doctoral program at the University of Denver and Iliff School of Theology in the study of religion. But my background is in film and television. And primarily my project is focusing on sort of on-screen storytelling in the way of TV and film and sometimes even video games, and how streaming services are sort of changing that. But I have a lot of crossover with fandom and online communities and how people sort of formulate meaning making and communities sort of in semi-religious or religious ways around popular culture and on-screen storytelling, and also memes. Memes is sort of a sidebar thing that I love. That's my like digital material little nugget. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Heidi. And I love how with everything that's been happening with the stock market in the United States recently, they're now calling them meme stocks. And I'm like, but that's, memes, stocks are memes already, sort of. So
yeah, that was the entire reason I tuned in. Someone's like, oh, Reddit made stocks a meme. I was like, meme? Sorry, meme? What?
All right, thank you for being here, Heidi. And we're going to go over then to Kang. I'm going to make sure I got that right, or please introduce yourself so we get it right.
Is it me? My turn?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, well, hi everyone. My name is Fajar Kartika. I'm Indonesian. I am now studying in Nottingham University in Malaysia. But since in the pandemic, going back to Indonesia and studying from home. I'm a PhD candidate in American Studies. I am now writing my dissertation about Harley Davidson, and I am not sure whether Harley Davidson is belongs to pop culture or not, and that's why I'm joining you here so I can get a clear picture. Thank you very much, everyone.
I love whenever I hear, because as an American, whenever I hear other people doing American studies and the insights that people have on America, I think is just fascinating, because I've been having a lot of discussions about what constitutes American culture recently. And looking at subcultures within America, I think is just great to do. So thank you for being here. And we'll go over to Rebecca.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Finkel. I'm at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. I don't sound Scottish because I am not. I've been over here 20 years though, so you think my accent would change, but I'm not Madonna, I suppose. I am originally from New York, and I was just supposed to go for a year for a master's, but I ended up staying. So I study festivals. I am a critical events studies person, and I'm getting more and more interested in the idea of fandoms and looking at festival fandoms. And just had a paper published recently with Louise Barrière, who's in France. We met over Twitter, never met in real life, because that's you know how it works these days, and it's wonderful. Although I would love to go to France once the lockdown is lifted. But we just got a paper published on festival fandoms and the material culture and the materiality of festivals. So looking at sort of the ideas of status and social capital, well, all sorts of capitals, you know, in a sort of Bourdieusian way, associated with the material culture of festivals. So this is something that's becoming more and more interesting to me, looking at this idea of culture, of fans, of materiality, but all sort of framed within events. So that's me. Nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you, Rebecca. And it'll definitely be interesting to see what happens to festivals once all of these lockdowns happen, and the extent to which people will go in droves, or how much they'll still be kind of wary of it.
I know. I think the blended model is sort of here to stay, but I think there is definitely like an appetite to be among other people, even if wary. I know I miss being around people, but yet I'm like, anytime I see someone, I'm like, stay away. So I think that that's actually a really going to be an interesting tension, and especially when it comes to communities and identity, which is also sort of something I look at as well.
All right, thank you for being here, Rebecca. And then we'll go up to Leah.
Thanks. It's pronounced Leah. Just I answer to everything, but not a problem. My name is Leah Steuer. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, so shout out to Chris for being in the UW system. It's a balmy 15 degrees here in Madison, and it's horrible. Yeah, I'm a fourth year PhD candidate. I'm currently working on my dissertation around what I'm kind of calling somatic reception, so thinking about the body as the primary engine for reading and watching and meaning making of media text. So for me, reception is an inherently material act. So I was really kind of excited to you know, learn from all of these different threads here. I'm looking a lot in my work at you know, bodies that are marked by difference, you know, including, you know, race, gender, sexuality, but primarily disability and how they intersect. Thinking about things like sensory impairments or being homebound, which we're all very familiar with now, neurodivergency, and how we can think about those experiences as actually being, you know, quite material when it comes to making meaning out of text, but also universal, right? So we all have these very unique challenges and abilities with our own bodies when it comes to meeting the text. So in my work, I'm kind of trying to reject this idea of a normative physical or material relationship with media, and instead thinking about how every time we encounter television, film, or digital content, it's very non-normative, because each of our bodies is quite non-normative in its own way.
Thank you. I like that idea of challenging that normative idea when it comes to reception, and because I'm hoping, and maybe this is just me personally, but I'm really hoping that this pandemic has helped us to challenge that idea of normal. And I think I've said this before on these dialogues, that if I hear one more person say they want to return to normal, or that this is the new normal, I'm going to scream, because I hate that word normal at this point. But that's an aside. And I kind of want to just get us started on a possibly a rather interesting question, because when we think about where popular culture studies really started and where this notion of cultural studies even started, it was kind of just material, right? Because we didn't have the digital until far more recently. So if material culture is kind of what popular culture was always studying, what is material culture now that we have digital popular culture, now that we have the digital? Whoever'd like to go first.
I mean, I think that this divide between material and digital it's tricksy, because it's not exactly real, right? Like, the digital is material, right? Like, even if something like if we're comparing, I come from fandom and audience studies, so thinking of something like the idea of collection, right? When you're differentiating between, say, collecting playing cards versus like digital characters, I think we want to think of those as two completely different activities with different meanings for people. But in the end, I think many fans, when they're asked about how they feel towards their collections, I think they feel like they feel like a very material and visceral connection to even these sort of like fake cards they might collect online, or characters, etc. And we also have to think about the fact that, like, interacting with the digital popular culture through the digital also necessitates something like engaging with a device, right? Like a haptic screen. So I don't think that there is this divide so much as like a continuum between both. I think we can think about materials in a digital way, where we have these sort of like virtual feelings, where we project our life experiences onto inanimate objects, or we can think about digital activity as being like quite material, something that's sensorial for people.
To follow up with what you were saying, I think it's really important to also discuss how fans are sharing their objects right now, and it's digital. They're taking photos of their collections, they're cosplaying and actually cosplaying virtually. And the act of cosplay is super material because there's so many objects they use. And I think it's really also important to think about, like, in terms of if we're trying to divide materiality of digital, how do we place objects which are sold as print, such as this book, and come with a digital version or digital gifts? I don't work in video games, but video games are a really good example of that, because they often come with DLC, which is digital. So we sold with the physical box, but the actual object is digital. But as they were saying, the relationship the fan has with it, it's the same. They have a strong emotional relationship with it. So it's just little problems to consider, problematize this question.
One thing
Victoria, I like that you brought up. Oh no, you go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, Victoria, I like that you brought up cosplay, because even before the pandemic, which is sort of maybe a heightened, well, I guess heightening what was sort of already happening in a lot of different ways in different spheres. There's this sort of online notion of Pixar didn't happen, right? So yes, you might, go to a con and cosplay, or, really invest in something material, but it sort of lives on. There's this sort of extended life and afterlife in digital spaces of, essentially like online photo albums and photo sharing. And now that's just become even more important, because that's now the primary way of engaging with someone's material collection, or cosplaying, or whatever it might be. But I was going to say, I'm actually really eager to hear what Chris thinks about games and board games, because I myself have been playing a lot of games with friends on Zoom, and I keep trying to find, like, are there virtual ways of playing board games? And like Jackbox exists, which is fine, but what if I want to play, not Monopoly, because I don't really like Monopoly, but what if I want to play some online game? Or I've even seen there's like virtual versions of like Cards Against Humanity type things. So that's really interesting, because I do think there is something happening when you are physically in a room with people. And then that's when you start getting into different ideas about, you know, either new materialism or, you know, even spirituality, or, I mean, there's obviously something physical and biological there happening too, but then there's also something more than that, because, okay, well, if it's just about sort of talking and having a conversation and being together, we're all in the same room. But I think we would all acknowledge that would feel differently if we were actually in a room, you know, whether that be there's a physical element, or we can smell each other, or we could touch each other. You know, these other senses that we're not entirely engaging with on here. But anyway, I would love to hear what Chris thinks about online games.
Well, and it's funny because I'm actually working, because at UWM, I'm part of a group called Serious Play, and we are a group of Twitch streamers who stream video games and analog games and RPGs. And one of the things that we've been dealing with throughout the pandemic is, you know, like, especially for my show, Board Meeting, where we play board and card games, it's like, how do you keep that going when you can't be in this same room? But, you know, there are a lot of technologies now that are designed to sort of try to replicate the in-person tabletop experience in a digital environment. There's Tabletop Simulator, which you can get through Steam. There's Tabletopia, which is a website that you can go on. There's a new one called the Vorpal board, which is this hardware software combination where you scan, like one person scans in all the pieces of the board game, and then it like makes them digital. So only one person needs the board, and then everybody else just logs into a website and they manipulate the pieces digitally. So, but it does, you know, it helps to keep things going. Like, I've played more board games since the pandemic started than I have in the last 10 years, probably. You know, my friends, I have friends who I get together with on the weekend, and we fire up Tabletop Simulator, or my buddy has a Vorpal board, and we'll just play games. And it's the same thing with the Serious Play group. You know, we're actually going to be playing today at noon. It's a way to keep going with your hobby, but it does fundamentally change things. You're not, like you said, you're not in the same room. You're not manipulating, you know, the physical pieces. There's something about, especially for me, I like to play a lot of games that have like minis, like miniatures, and I don't paint them or anything because I'm not artistically inclined, but you know, there is something about having that little mini and having that like physical object that you can move around the board, which is very different than when you like, you know, have to click on your mouse and move it around that way. I think the best description that I've heard of like Tabletop Simulator, a lot of fans say that it's like playing a board game wearing boxing gloves while using chopsticks. And it is like that. Like, Tabletop Simulator has a really, really steep learning curve, which already adds on to the steep learning curve of some of the games that we play. Mm-hmm. So it really changes the experience of being able to just like, you know, grab a box off the shelf, throw the board open, and get all the pieces up. But then again, sometimes it makes it easier because sometimes people will like script the digital versions where you can just click a button and everything is like, boom, it's all set up, and you're just like, oh, okay, well that was easy. So there's a lot of like affordances and constraints in these digital things, but the fundamental act of like getting together with people is really changed by that, especially when you have like tech issues. I know, like, you know, we'll be playing on the Vorpal board and suddenly it'll boot me out of the system, and it's like, you know, when I'm with my friends, I don't like suddenly just like appear in the bathroom and like, what is going on? You know, it's like we're all there and we all are present, whereas you're not always that way in the digital realm. So I don't know. Like I said, there's good and bad for both. And one thing, just real quick, that I wanted to say that I was going to say before is I think one of the things that people use to like differentiate the digital versus the material is like ephemerality. You know, like there's this idea that the physical is there. It's, you know, it's not going away. And I mean, I know this, like I have, you can't see them if they're off camera, but I have like over 1,000 Blu-rays and DVDs like right over here. Because for me, I don't trust all these streaming services and whatnot. You know, I want to be able to just, if I want to watch a movie, I go to the shelf, I grab it off, and I throw it in the Blu-ray player. Whereas, you know, like I went to watch season 2 of Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal on HBO Max. And it was there forever. And then I went to sit down and watch it and it wasn't there anymore. And I was like, what is going on? Where did it go? But that idea of ephemerality is really tricky because, you know, my board games are going to deteriorate at some point and go away and break down and fall apart and all this stuff. So I don't know like what the differentiating factor is in between the digital and the material. Just in terms of like, it's there, I can play it. It's just in a different environment, you know, and it's like Leah was saying with that haptic screen or touching the keyboard or whatever, that adds that material element to that.
Chris, you're making me think of, I've been playing board games with friends on Zoom, but in like a very strange way where we both have the same game. So I'll roll for my friend and move her piece. And for me, there's something that is more nourishing about that, because I think when you talk about the like ephemerality part of this, I think what's ephemeral is I'm transmuting my relationship with my friend onto her game piece, right? So it feels like there's a closeness because like she's not there, I'm rolling for her, there's something a little bit sort of silly about me making all the moves, but there's an affective component that I'm adding that's ephemeral, right? It doesn't stick with the piece. We've been playing a lot of Jumanji, which if you've ever seen Jumanji is dangerous. I shouldn't be playing that game. But there is this notion that like we are the ephemeral ones, right? The objects, I mean, they're ephemeral in the sense that they may deteriorate, but I think it's more like the affective ties that we're putting on the material are really these sort of the most important and least important thing here. If that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to talk to you, Leah, or everybody really, but you mentioned sort of the idea of the body. And I think that that's kind of what we're talking about, this idea of embodied experiences. And, you know, and I agree with Chris, it's not good or bad, it's just different. But the thing is that we only really have like one choice right now. So that's the choice we have. But I mean, in terms of issues of accessibility and like inclusion and stuff, in many respects, having things more digital supposedly makes things, you know, to some level and to some people more accessible. So the idea of certain types of games or, you know, Twitch or, you know, I don't study video games or play video games, but supposedly it's a lot more accessible. And I just wondered, you know, sort of what you're thinking of was that, you know, with that. And I see what you're saying about like that idea of affect on, you know, onto objects, you know, they represent your friend and stuff like that. But, you know, there's something still missing there, isn't there, in terms of connection? But then again, it's sort of like, yes, but isn't it also accessible? So I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but just sort of, you had mentioned, you know, sort of disabled bodies and so forth. And I just sort of wanted to know, you know, sort of kind of what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think, well, it seems like what you're getting at is there's all the rhetoric in like our pop culture right now about us being sort of like forced to stay at home, like our experiences are impoverished, right? Because we're lacking that, you know, some really essential tactile sensory dimension of humanity, right? And it's interesting because I feel like, I'm not sure what your you know, social media or Twitter feeds look like, but I see a lot of people in my Twitter feed that have, you know, chronic illnesses, they're homebound or some other sort of, you know, physical issue, that they've always been in this state of isolation, right? They've always been in this state of impoverishment. So there's simultaneously a relief that other bodies are now sort of experiencing these conditions, but also a frustration, right? That there's like a recognizance that like this is a new normal, as you said, Carrie Lynn, right? But for many people, it is like the regular normal, regular sensory and tactile normal. I think that like when we can kind of find a positive in that or push back against it is, instead of thinking about disabled bodies as having this sort of frustrated access to materials, like Liz Elsesser and her work on disabled media viewers and bodies is all about this idea of frustrated access, right? But I think we also find that for many people that have to access the world differently, their media, but also their pop culture, their friends, etc. It's not about impoverishment. It's about finding ways around the sort of limits that devices or text put on them, right? So one example would be, one of my chapters in my dis is about vision impaired TV audiences, right? And we assume that because you can't see the characters, that you have less of an affective connection, or because you're missing that material dimension, there's something missing from your connection to the text. But instead, I think we find that there's like a new materiality, a richer materiality to the sound, right? For people whose bodies are not allowing them access in some way. So yeah, I guess like it almost makes me sad thinking about like how most of the conversation is about like what we don't have, what we're not feeling, when in reality, many people have never had these things and are finding alternate ways to connect, to feel.
That's really interesting things. Yeah, I mean, instead of impoverishment, I would say inconvenience. That's sort of the thing that kind of gets me. Just like Carrie Lynn, your new normal. Mine is that it's just like for most people, it's inconvenience. For a lot of people are suffering, and there's like really bad things happening. So if really bad things are not happening to you, you're inconvenienced. That's my kind of thing. But that's really, that's really interesting. About that idea that like, okay, now everybody, other people are experiencing what I've been experiencing all along, but perhaps, can we, and another expression that's being used a lot over here is build back better. Can we build back better? Can we take that knowledge, can we not lose that, sort of linked into that idea of like not going back to normal because that's what got us into this. So that idea of, okay, can we find a way to, sort of, include people who, have been experiencing this for a long time. Can we find that into a better way? So thanks very much. That's so interesting. I find it really interesting too when we're just talking about fandoms. If I'm allowed to switch gears a little bit, but please let me know. We can talk about something else. For some reason, oh, my dog also agrees with you. For some reason, I have been obsessed with the idea of Elvis impersonators. So the idea that Elvis impersonators, and it's sort of this cosplay thing, like going back to what Victoria was saying, this idea of performance online. And, but the thing that gets me, and specifically sort of Elvis impersonators or any sort of cover group, you can see the real thing on YouTube. So, what are they doing? Like, I feel like they usually have conventions and festivals and these sorts of things. So it's sort of like they'll have to do something extra special, won't they? Otherwise you could see Elvis on YouTube. So it's just in terms of like these sorts of fandoms around this kind of, its own imitation becomes its own art form. But, is that something that translates digitally? Because certain things translate better digitally, like book festivals are great digitally. Comedy, oh man, not so much. Have you guys seen comedy online? It's so cringeworthy. You need the laughs. It's really hard. So I just feel for the Elvis impersonators, and I just wanted to just sort of put that out there.
I also just want to throw quickly to our sixth member who hasn't said anything yet, but I remember you were saying you also study biker subculture, which is probably also something that doesn't translate to the digital terribly well either, come to think of it.
Yeah, well, thank you. About digital activities, like what Leah said, in my place, in my country, the digital activity has changed the way people communicate to each other. For example, the way I'm teaching in university also, we have a kind of a guidebook or a rule book that manage students, how students should communicate to the teacher. The time, because they use WhatsApp or Telegram. We also have rules for students not to use some emoticons. Yeah? They can use some emoticon, but not all emoticon can be used. So that's what happened in my country. So yeah, digital activities has changed the way we communicate.
And I was also thinking too about the sense of the frustrated access and the extent to which You were talking about Leah in terms of disability, but I'm also thinking in terms of class and national boundaries too, and how that impacts our access to material and digital at this point. But Chris, you wanted to say something about the comedy?
Well, I was going to say that to me is really interesting because of how like professional comedians are adapting to the digital thing. Like Maria Bamford just the other day did a concert for one person over Zoom. She tweeted out, she's like, does anybody want a comedy show? And somebody responded, and then Maria Bamford did this show for this other person. And it was such a really interesting, and then she put the video up online. And it's such an interesting, like, connective kind of thing, you know, that they wouldn't get that with their audience any other way than through this like digital thing, you know, like we think of comedy, like you go to a club and there's a person on stage and, you know, that's the only connection you get. But this digital format has really changed that. But then the other thing I just really wanted to interject real quick was, speaking of Elvis impersonators, I used to know somebody who, and this also intersects with the cosplay thing, because I used to know a guy, I worked with him at a call center years ago, and he was Elvok, the Klingon Elvis. And he had a batleth guitar and everything. And
there's the differentiation.
Kind of,
I love it.
What?
Sorry, it's just like, I love that. I love that. The differentiation, you know, it just, that's what made him him. So
yeah.
that's
amazing. And he was quite popular in fan circles for a while there. Like he was well known in the Star Trek fandom because of that persona that he adopted. But he had the, you know, like speaking of material culture, you know, he had the full like Elvis outfit, but it had like Klingon accoutrement on it, and then he had the batleth guitar, and he had like the forehead, but with a pompadour.
That's hilarious. That's two. It's like kind of like intersecting fandoms, though. So you're getting like lots of different sort of popularity from that. That's funny. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, what you were saying about you know, the fake Elvis, and you can go see the real thing on YouTube, but you need to get some sort of like watered down version through, you know, Bar Elvis, or I've seen a lot of Drag King Elvises. They're great too. Actually reminded me a lot of what Heidi was talking about with you know, religious culture connecting to fan culture, right? Because maybe this might seem like a side road, but I grew up Jewish, and I was always very fascinated with like the wafer at my friends' churches, and it's just like, you're eating Jesus, like that's so wild to me. Like I get so hungry during shul. That sounds great. But like there is this idea that you know, religion is material culture. I don't know if you can speak on this, Heidi, but when I think about going to see, you know, a drag king Elvis or something, or an Elvis impersonator, it's like I can't get to the real thing, right? Elvis is now, he was a man, now he's just this, you know, weird, you know, pop culture vapor, but I can get to some form of the material, right? By getting to fake Elvis. And I'm wondering if you do find a connection in this idea of the representation of religious icons.
Oh, absolutely. It's funny. I didn't even realize I have my laptop propped up on some books, and one of them is Material Christianity by McDaniel. And she basically does a lot of really helpful tracing of Christianity has always been very material. And I think there can be an assumption with a lot of different kinds of religions that it's the spiritual elements that are more important or less important, depending on which one you're talking about. And in fact, the body has always been involved. I mean, Leah, I think even what you're talking about with the body as sort of like a type of mediation and a type of reception, receptacle. It's not just like, oh, we're a sack of flesh. Like it's actually part of the everything else that we're doing, you know? But I think you're right. I mean, immediately when, you know, Rebecca, when you're kind of talking about Elvis impersonators, and like, what is the draw? Especially if then you're losing a physical element. For me, I wonder too, if a piece of it is just an element of almost reverence or iteration, you know, the idea of like actually performing like as a way of sort of revering or, oh, what were you saying?
Oh, sorry, like almost ritual. So
Yeah.
sort of like almost like this Durkheim kind of social ritual thing that keeps the community together. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, That's, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. That was like a really great thought, because, you know, all that symbolism and all that, like, you know, the objects and stuff like that. I mean, that ties into that idea of like ritual, and it's that ritually repeated action that kind of is the way that societies sort of show their values and show who they are collectively. So, you know, if you apply that to Elvis, I suppose you can really. That's interesting, or like any sort of thing like that. Yeah, interesting. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, and it's fun. I mean, I think that's the other part too, that like we really do need to consider, is that that's part, like not every ritual. I think sometimes we think ritual or reverence or belief or religion or community, we think serious and like the wafer and all that. And yes, but also some people are like having fun or enjoying something, and they're getting positive elements out of it. And it's like, well, someone just enjoys performing as Elvis, and that's a part of who they are. And then other people enjoy watching because maybe they like the same thing, or they're, you know, like you said, Leah, sort of getting at something that doesn't exist in the literal way anymore. But also with the comedy element. So I've been on TikTok a lot, really for the last year. So even before when the pandemic hit, and it's been interesting to see it shift with the pandemic. And I think in terms of comedy, it's almost sort of a yes and thing. And a lot of this sort of is, right? So there are some people that prefer going to a comedy show in person, prefer playing a board game in person. And there's some people that suddenly have a different, really amazing kind of access with a virtual experience of that. And same thing, there are comedians who are delivering different kinds of material through these spaces that don't require an immediate audience, or at least an audience that is like, you can hear them laughing or clapping.
Or comedy that wouldn't work if people were laughing in the middle. Exactly.
Yeah, comedy that requires editing, but you can, it's still very self-sustaining. And it was funny because you're mentioning Maria Bamford, but I know that I remember watching one of her Netflix specials that she presents in the form of, she's just performing for her parents. Yep. And she did that years ago, right? And so that it's almost like a pre sort of Zoom version. I didn't know that she did this Zoom version. That's really cool to hear that. But, you know, I think humans are really creative things, and we find really creative ways of doing things. And I think the pandemic has challenged us to sort of yes and it, and be like, oh, okay, yeah, we can, like you said, building better. And I think that is such an important piece of this, is like, it's not like, oh, virtual is better or in-person is better. It's like, some people are having more nourishing experiences. Some people are having more impoverished experiences, kind of depending on who they are and what their bodily and mental and emotional experiences are like. So I think, you know, moving forward, it's like, I want to be in game circles that are in person and other ones where we're sometimes virtual, because you're just going to get different kinds of experiences or meet different people through those different modes.
I want to really follow up to what you're saying.
Oh no, frozen.
Okay, she froze on everybody else's. Oh no. Victoria,
to a phenomenon that happened about a year ago due to the pandemic.
Wait,
so cosplayers got together.
Victoria, you froze momentarily. Can you go back?
Like with what I was saying? Or
yeah, just start over.
Are you guys able to hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I will start over. Okay, so following what Heidi was saying, I wanted to discuss a phenomenon that occurred about a year ago as a result of the pandemic. So, because we're talking about ritual and this like digital promotion and sharing of mutual objects, and about a year ago, all the cosplayers were sad because the conventions were canceled. And so what they did was cosplayers in different locations where so far they would never meet, they created a video of them in their normal dress like this, and then in their cosplay. And then they threw something, maybe a brush. And in the video, it transforms, and we see someone else of the same series now doing it. Their normal cosplay, their normal outfit, and then their cosplay. And the video goes on and on. And I really love that, because we often see cosplay culture sometimes as a regional product because it's very local. Like cosplayers get together, they make objects together. But through that video and this digital engagement, cosplayers were able to make their fandom very international, and then show what they're creating and what meanings they're creating with their objects in a single video. So I just wanted to bring that up because I thought it was a really good example of all the things we've been discussing so far.
that's become this really interesting meme too, because you see, especially like on TikTok, you have those short videos where I've seen that not just with cosplayers, but like the indigenous people, the Native American tribes here, you see a lot of them doing it where they will be in what we would consider more everyday clothes, but then they would do like that shoe drop or whatever you want to call it. And suddenly they're in their ceremonial garb and they're performing their rituals actually. And it's fascinating then to see how that meme has been operating across, well, across various cultures then.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's interesting to me to see these many of these like viral TikTok trends. It almost goes back to what you were first talking about, Carrie Lynn, with like the difference between material and digital. It seems like these trends are glomming on because there's a reference to something material that we can grab onto, like that brush, right? Like the clothing, etc. I think a lot about to me, like a sourdough loaf is like the object, like the mascot of the beginning of the pandemic, right? And then there's all these, pieces of digital evidence. Here's my bread, all these TikToks about like panic baking. So like representing your emotions through like what you're making, but there's always like a visual reference to something material, so we can almost feel like we're holding it and we're feeling it. And that's what's interesting here. It's so vexing because it's like you need that reference to the physical world to make this digital connection really, really work.
So
I
can
wanted
we
to bring up real
can we
quick.
consider digital as can we consider digital culture as material culture? It is. It is also.
Yeah, and to kind of to build off that a little bit, that I'm currently working on a paper with a colleague, and it's about gaming in the age of COVID. And one of the things that we were talking about the other day, and I'm not sure who came up with this idea, but there's this concept of like situational affordances, where certain things. And I'm pretty sure I'm saying that I'm correct in that, but it's like certain things will have affordances in certain situations. So like now that we're all kind of stuck at home, the digital has become this like situational affordance that allows us to do things that we were doing in the before times, and so like we were talking about how the fact that we, can play board games via tabletop simulator, or we can play D&D over the internet, suddenly opens up more possibilities. Like, my friend has a D&D group, and they were saying, if we had to get together face to face, we probably wouldn't be able to play as much because they have kids and they, the other people in the group can't always get together. But now that we can do it digitally, we can do it online, suddenly we have more regular sessions to play. And like I said, with me and my friends, we've played more, like we played Pandemic Legacy, the board game Pandemic Legacy, throughout the first 8 months of the pandemic. And it was like, we wouldn't have been able to do that because I live in Glenview, Illinois, and they live up in northeastern Wisconsin. So it wouldn't have been as regular had we had to do it physically and in that same space. So this idea of like situational affordance, I think, is a really important thing to sort of keep in mind. And I don't remember who came up with this concept or whatever, and I apologize. So whoever did it, you have all the credit. I just don't know who you are. But yeah, I think it's an integral thing to think about. And it goes along with what you were saying about how the digital is the material. Suddenly it's just like another component of the material connection.
Well, and because part of the affordances we have to consider is, this screen, the computer, the technology you use to get to this, the infrastructure behind all of this, definitely the companies that control all of this too. We cannot forget the fact that everything digital has all of these material components that make it possible or make it less possible, and for some people impossible.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna going to say is that there's this other element to consider. You know, all of it is sort of on a spectrum in that way, that it's a few things happening at the same time. There's the affordances, there's, you know, there's in another way access and lack of access, or now new kinds of access, depending on where you were before and where things are now. But there's also the element of kind of materially what my life is like in my apartment, right? And then I am entering sort of a virtual space or collaborating in a virtual space, but that has such an effect, right? Like the fact that I live alone in my own apartment, and it, you know, that has an effect on then how I'm experiencing this, as opposed to someone who, you know, like I have been in touch with a lot of different undergraduate students, especially who are dealing, and, you know, anyone that's kind of even gracing any element of online teaching and learning right now, not everyone is like learning that way. And, you know, there's this element of like, oh, I have to go hide in a closet or a room to get away from everything else in my current material space to be able to do certain things. So, you know, again, it's just sort of like, yes, and all at the same time, and all in these different spectrums of, you know, some, and then what happens if you start thinking of anyone who's doesn't have any access to these digital and virtual spaces, and the assumption, I think for me, what's helpful is the Twitter assumption. So I'm on Twitter and I just sort of assume it's a helpful representation of how the world is feeling about things. It's not. I recently saw a very helpful visualization of like how small Twitter is in terms of who's on it and who's engaging with it, as opposed to something like even Google or Amazon, which even that doesn't capture everything, of course, but that is how we're still seeing things through these very tiny lenses. And, you know, that kind of perspective, it can humble us, but it can also just feel really overwhelming too, right? Like, how do we carry all these things at the same time? And I mean, is that even possible?
That difference between being extremely online.
Yeah. And for me, like, I think I also see there's a lot of, you know, consideration of like what being extremely online or extremely digital always comes with the fear or like the resigned acceptance of, you know, surveillance and having all of these actions tracked, which I think is something that Heidi brought up for me. I'm sorry, my cat is like everywhere right now. But it kind of made me think about like what if one of the deep lures of material culture is almost like the untrackability of the physical actions, right? Like there's not really a way for Hasbro to like feel me or see me playing my board game, right? Like there might be figures on like how many people have bought the game, or when we choose to document ourselves playing, like we might be feeding intelligence, you know, to some sort of corporate entity. But in the end, the actual act of using the materials, it's very hard for there to be any really, we're not consenting to that kind of surveillance as we are when we're, you know, playing a game online, right? And it reminds me a lot of the pleasure that I get from utilizing my VHS collection, which is very large and I've had to move everywhere with me. But when I choose to watch something, right, it's almost like it's happening in 1996. Like no one knows that I'm choosing this tape. No one's surveilling me watching it. It's not feeding into any kind of algorithm of what I've chosen to do. And I wonder if that, you know, resonates with anyone else, like the relationship between material or real life stuff and surveillance. And there's a comfort in knowing that there's less of that possibility.
I want to raise just a point to that there's some material that in a sense has always been tracked, and that specifically I'm thinking about the export of character goods coming from Japan. Like there's a document of that being imported into another country and then being sold and distributed and so forth. So even if that's like pre-digital, I'm going to talking about like all paperwork and so forth. It's another way to think about like what type of material engagement is public, semi-public is what I'm going to use for this, my super academic term, for the post documents, and then actually private. And then are we able to actually have private engagement with the material world unless we actually have a VHS collection, which I don't have. So.
And I'd also like to just shout out to cassette tapes right now, because nothing got better after we got rid of cassette tapes. I'm gonna agree with that. Yeah. So but no, I think that's a really, really interesting point about you know, and it's almost this kind of thing where we don't even think about it, like, you know, in terms of it's just become so normalized, that kind of, you know, data protection and just, you know, well, I've got to watch, you know, I've got to watch TV, so I'm going to put on Netflix and they're going to recommend stuff based on an algorithm. And so, you know, that's just, we've kind of become almost complicit in that kind of aspect. And okay, you know, maybe it's not the end of the world, there's worse things in the world, but I think you raised a really interesting point about that idea of trackability. And, you know, is that something we should miss? You know, or is it just, you know, a different way of thinking about things that we were used to at one point, you know, and some people aren't even used to that anymore. So it's kind of like when movies became color, you know, is that something we should miss, the black and white? It's obviously, you know, if you talk to film people, black and white is much better than color, you know, colorization, but, you know, it was seen as quote unquote progress, right? So, so it's a real, I don't know what to do at that point, but I've written it down and I'm very interested in it. So thank you.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, which, you know, so I'm very invested in sort of the ways that the TV industry especially has changed with Netflix. And I think a really helpful metaphor that Amanda Lotz, media studies scholar Amanda Lotz, brings up is the comparison of streaming services or portals with kind of the book industry. So it's not necessarily like we have never seen this before. It's just we haven't necessarily seen it before with television, right? So, you know, the idea that there are a bunch of things and they're sort of released all at once and you have access to them, and maybe you go to a bookstore and they recommend something. In the same way, we've always sort of lived in a world of recommendations. I mean, before a TV show or a movie would be on TV and that was your only option. So yes, there's an element of filtering, but you still have the choice of like, am I going to choose something based on the algorithm or not? And there's sort of different codes and cheat codes around Netflix algorithms and different things. And some people like the curation of that and some people don't. And so it's sort of, instead of it being a deterministic experience, right? Like, oh, I'm on Netflix, I'm being told what to watch. It's like, well, what happens when you go to a movie theater? There's 10 choices, that's it. And you're probably going because someone told you that they enjoyed that movie. And so it's just remembering that this is still part of the culture of the way that we watch things and do things. But back to that, you know, untrackable or unsurveilled experience of playing a board game in your house or watching a VHS, which I had a VHS collection for quite a while until someone in my family decided that that's going to not be there. That got garage saled. It's fine. You know, I think we're all going to survive. But I think too, I wonder if it's also playing with this idea of like eternal versus mortal. Right? When you are, there's something fleeting happening. When I am playing a board game with friends, we're having this sort of like fleeting moment. There's jokes that happen in the moment and that's it. No one's recording it, as opposed to maybe a Twitter thread about someone talking about a game or even a chat that's happening, you know, during a Twitch stream. And it's almost like recording the experience or aspects of the experience. And so I think on the one hand, there's an eternal kind of forever aspect to doing things digitally, but there's the risk of surveillance. And maybe when we're doing things in person, it sort of forces us to reckon with fleetingness and mortality and things that are temporary, but they have that like a certain kind of specialness and like a non-watch, like no one else is a part of it except for whoever's there. So maybe that, and it's not a total like line drawn, you know, black and white thing, but I wonder if that's sort of the dance that's happening there.
That's interesting, Heidi, too, because I can almost, if I can, I'm going to add performance to that, to what you just said. So that idea of performance, and when we know that something is perhaps lasting or something that is for other audiences or this and that, do we act differently? Do we interact with the material culture differently than if we're just sort of, you know, in person, alone with friends, like having a laugh, like, you know, back when back in the old days, before the pandemic, you know, when we would be together with friends and be like, okay, no pictures, no social media, let's just enjoy the the moment, and you have to sort of declare this, and it's it's not, again, it's not better or worse, it's different, because I think there is a performance aspect to that as well, and also and not only relationships but interaction as well with objects and with things, and you know, kind of that element. And I think that, you know, I've just sort of dabbled in performance studies, but I think there's definitely something there as well from what you're saying. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and I would argue it's happening both, right? You know, if I have like a little Judith Butler voice in the back of my head, you know, she would say
there's always a Judith Butler voice in the back of her head.
And it's really long and hard to understand.
But yeah, you know, I think that there's elements of performance when you're with your friends and elements of performance online, but they are different, right? Or there's a very high likelihood that they're kind of happening in different ways.
And but you can see that even, oh, sorry, just to add to that quickly, like you can see that when you're having a voice call with someone or a video call with someone as well. You can, like, it's completely different. Not that I'm being different with you guys, because I am actually like nodding and pretending that you can see me just because my video doesn't work. Sorry.
Well, I wanted to like pull a thread out of this idea of performance, which I think is like really apt to bring up in a discussion around materiality and objects. I guess this is more of like a quick plug, but I always thought about fandom culture, specifically like there's a divide between material things you do as a fan, your cosplay, your collection, right? And then something like fan fiction, fan art, etc. Like these are sort of more, you know, digital things that you do in the ether that may not involve as much sort of material engagement, or like imagination is not material. But when you talk about performance, Rebecca, it makes me think of Francesca Cappa's work on fan fiction, and it being sort of like a theatrical performance with these material characters that you're almost moving around like dolls and rehearsing in different positions, rather than thinking about it as a process of you know, rewriting. It's instead almost like you're in your mind palace and you're taking these beloved objects that feel viscerally real and just sort of like putting them into different positions. So I think we can also think about performance as not necessarily even being tied to, you know, physical objects or physical situations, but something where we're making you know, imagination and objects that we're only seeing in the mind's eye like very material and reperforming them too.
Well, I think we're reaching about that hour mark, so I just wanted to get us into the wrap-up mode, to use basically a material metaphor to talk about our digital virtual experience. So just to maybe wrap things up, do you have any thoughts to conclude on in terms of, because we are still in the pandemic, what you think the material popular culture might be like after the pandemic is done, if it, I mean, knock on wood, when it is done? What do you think the material popular culture will be like? What might be the things to look for? I just wanted to like throw that out for each of you to comment on, to wrap up today.
Well, I'll start, I guess, because one thing that I've been thinking about, you know, as a film fan, we're seeing how the pandemic is impacting cinema. You know, in that like movie theaters are in a lot of trouble. You know, I think every year since film was invented, there's been something about the death of cinema, but we're kind of seeing like the death of physical cinemas, I think, right now. And it's impacting the way that we interact with film. I mean, film was kind of, you know, there was an impact because of the shift to like digital production and projection and things like that. And you had those people like Quentin Tarantino and Christopher Nolan who were kind of like hanging on to using physical film. But I follow a lot of film critics on Twitter, and a lot of them are talking about like, oh, you know, it's so great that cinemas are going away, and now, you know, the world of cinema is basically, and they're being sarcastic when they say that. They're like, it's so great that cinemas are going away, and now all these films are just housed in this constellation of streaming services, and there's no guarantee that they're gonna, you know, keep things up or whatever. And that to me is really, you know, a big factor for me. But then you look and you see things like micro cinemas are thriving. These cinemas where they have like one screen and they're able to sort of curate and program things in a way that appeals to like a very niche audience. And so I don't think, when I talk about like the death of cinema, I'm not saying like I don't think film is going away. I think we're going to see a shift in how it is delivered to people. And I think that we're going to see that in a lot of areas. I mean, I know even like board games, like board games are really popular right now, but the pandemic has impacted the industry in a lot of ways that make it seem like, they're in trouble in a lot of ways. So I think we're just going to see a different delivery system for a lot of different material cultures as we go forward.
Just to jump in on that, Chris, that's really interesting. We just got funding to do a study on Scottish film festivals. And so looking at the switch to digitization and this idea of, sort of liveness and, the embodied experience, and looking at this idea, like, the shift to digitization, what does it mean for the audiences? What does it mean for the programmers? Because is it just, a curation of films, or, because festivals have always been more than that. So how do you kind of capture that, online? And I think it's something that my husband always says this. He's a techie, and he's always like, you can't do what exists in the real world online. It's its own thing. And I think I'm finding that, at least with my teaching as well, I'm trying to do the same thing that I do in a classroom online. That's not going to work. It's its own thing. It's sort of like the early days of online retail, when everybody put their online catalog online, and you were like, I don't know how to buy anything or search for anything. And now, and you're like, this is ridiculous. Online, and everybody's like, oh, online shopping doesn't work. It's like, well, no, online shopping doesn't work if it's like physical shopping. It works if it's like online shopping. Like, look at us now, right? So I think that that's where we are. We're in those early days of putting the catalog online, and we need to adjust to the medium. And so I think it's kind of what Heidi said. It's a yes and. It doesn't have to be an or. So yeah, we'll see what we find out. We're interviewing for an RA next week, so if anybody fancies it. Just kidding. Actually, we're all very busy, so it's all good. Thank you very much. Sorry.
To follow up on that, I think so manga is usually sold with presents like this in Japan. This is just the book, this is the present, right? That's to encourage print sales, especially now because of the, everyone's reading digitally. Do anything you can to make the print sell, right? But I think there's another important thing to consider for this, and I think that these extras, I think they're going to be made digital, and that students will be able to hopefully buy digital manga with extras, and that's to promote digital sales, and the same way it's been used to promote print sales. And I think that would be really interesting to see how the materiality of just the world of manga and all the objects that are created around to it, how it transforms, because these presents that are included with manga have been around since for 65 years, I believe, for Nakayoshi. So it'd be really just fun. Like, when you look at the history of Nakayoshi and these presents, you see like transformations as they're addressing different social needs and different populations. And I think they were always print, they were always physical, but that's not going to be the case. So you'll be able to purchase them with digital little extras for our digital manga.
Well, I don't want to be like a total downer chiming in, but my main sort of takeaway, or what I feel will happen, is we will see a cultural reflection on the way the trauma of this time is held within the objects that we use to get through it, right? So I would be probably predicting TikTok trends of like mask burning, for better or for worse, once we don't need them, or like beating a loaf of homemade bread to death. Like, I think there's definitely, I would think that we would see sort of like a cultural backlash that might feel like collective healing from this time where we were forced to, you know, like transmute these affects onto to different kinds of objects that came to symbolize the pandemic. I just like pulled out of my desk. I've been making an absurd amount of bracelets just to keep myself occupied during long Zoom calls. I've never made thread bracelets in my life, but I can see myself, you know, a couple of years from now finding these and feeling within them, you know, the stress and the you know, the emotions of this time. So I feel like, yeah, there will be certain objects that will forevermore be identified as 2020 pandemic objects that will never truly shake that label.
I think you're right. And on a less violent note, I think it also comes back to what Victoria was saying. I think, like, I know, for example, a lot of people that hadn't been reading actual books anymore, like they had, like, you know, just online books, Kindles, are now reading actual books because they have screen fatigue. And like, it's just like, they're like, I don't want to spend my work day on a screen and then spend my leisure time on a screen. So like all of a sudden you're getting actual physical objects just due to almost like, as you were saying, like a backlash, but in a less violent way, I suppose, as well. That's interesting about the bracelets too, and the fact that, you know, again, has nothing to do with the bracelet, it's the symbolism and it's the representation of it, isn't it? And so, you know, that's a whole nother thing on, you know, performance and representation. So maybe just throw them away so you don't have to to deal with those kinds of emotions. I don't know.
Or maybe a cathartic thing too, right? I mean, I think that there are a lot of cultures and traditions and rituals that have, I think it goes back to that sort of mortality, eternal conversation, right? That there's actually a really special, there can be a specialness in holding an object that represents grief and anger and despair and loneliness. And that I think that there's especially a very American or a very Western instinct to be angry and to burn and to be cathartic about, and those things aren't bad either. But something about embracing the very real trauma that I think a lot of people are feeling and going through or maybe reflecting on later. But for a positive note, I will say, because I have also been in the conversations of movie theaters are dead for my whole life. It's also related to, I grew up in California, right? And so also the big one's coming, the big one's coming. Also Christian culture of the end of the world, the apocalypse, the rapture, it's coming, you know, and now I'm researching QAnon. And so there's, the storm is coming, the storm is coming. And so there's a lot of alarmist, we can gravitate toward that, right? Because maybe it captures the way we feel. We feel very intense. But then you reflect on something like nostalgia culture or revival, or the fact that like 3D came back for a while, like 3D, when no one thought that was like a funny hokey thing in the 80s. But in the same way, like people will always want to go to the movie theater. They just will. You know, drive-in movie theaters became a big thing. I went to a couple during the pandemic because that was a safer option. But drive-in movie theaters are also kind of making a comeback even before this. So I think resting in the idea that like we will still do things. Now, will it be done through a big conglomerate with a bunch of screens, or will it be, oh, I want to invest in my local movie theater and I want to go there and I want to. So I think the kind of global to local, you're seeing that a lot. I think you're right, across the board. People investing in mutual aid groups, people organizing locally, people connecting with, and that might be virtually locally, right? Like communities online that feel local to you, they feel personal. Maybe personal is better than local, as opposed to I'm going to trust, because right, we've sort of lost trust in some of these bigger companies for a whole lot of reasons, but that doesn't mean the sky is falling. It just means maybe we're building, you know, sort of smaller skies that we are still engaging with in really meaningful ways.
Yeah, well, in line with you all, that I think the dystopia movie genre will be popular, more popular. Yeah, who knows? The post-pandemic.
I think that's true. I mean, to me, I think part of it is we're going to want the material again. I think, and I don't know if it's going to last terribly long. Humanity seems to love their pendulum swings, and they love to go to extremes, probably far more than they should. So I think we will, after enough people are vaccinated, after we've handled this enough, I think we will see a huge swarm of the physical coming again. And then when we get tired of each other and we get tired of having to drive places, it'll go back to digital and it'll just keep on swinging. So maybe that's just to end the note of the dialogue on. It's just going to keep on swinging. So thank you everyone for coming today and sharing a bit of your time to talk through these things. And I hope it was, if not informative, it was at least interesting. It maybe was a little inspiring. You got some ideas. I know I've got all my Post-it notes to follow up on. And Heidi, I need to talk to you about Fans of Christ at some point. So yeah. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming today.
Thank you.
This was
Thank
so
you
Good
so
evening.
much. This was
Good
great.
evening, everyone.
Bye.
Nice to meet you guys. Thank you.